October 27, 1838. Jefferson City, Missouri. Governor Lilburn Boggs sits at his desk and writes an order to General John B. Clark, commander of the state militia. The order is brief and unambiguous. The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description. Read that again. Exterminated. An American governor has just ordered the extermination, the complete destruction, of a religious minority within his state's borders. Not arrest. Not prosecution. Extermination. 3 days later, on October 30, 1838, armed Missourians acting on this order attack a Mormon settlement at Haun's Mill. They kill 17 people, men and boys. One victim is a 10-year-old child who hid in a blacksmith shop. The attackers find him and shoot him in the head at point-blank range. The war resulted in 22 deaths and the displacement of 10,000 Latter-day Saints, most seeking refuge in the state of Illinois. 10,000 American citizens, men, women, children, driven from their homes at gunpoint in the dead of winter, their property seized, their leaders imprisoned, some killed, all because of their religious beliefs. This happened in America in 1838, and for 138 years it was legal. The extermination order was officially rescinded on June 25, 1976, by Governor Christopher Samuel Kit Bond. That's not ancient history. That's within living memory. For 138 years, Missouri state law officially authorized the extermination or expulsion of Mormons. This is the story of the Missouri Extermination Order, the Mormon War of 1838, when an American state declared war on its own citizens and then spent over a century pretending it never happened. The story begins with Joseph Smith, who in 1830 published the Book of Mormon and founded what would become the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Smith's new religion was controversial from the start. Claims of new scripture, angelic visitations, prophetic authority challenged established Christianity. But Smith wasn't just building a church. He was building a literal kingdom of God on earth. He called it Zion. Smith had a revelation suggesting that the land of their people would be near Jackson County, Missouri, where the second coming would take place and the city of Zion would be erected. So beginning in 1831, Mormon converts began gathering in Jackson County, Missouri. Hundreds, then thousands of believers sold their property in the east and migrated west to help build Zion. For perspective, Missouri in the 1830s was frontier territory, recently admitted to the Union in 1821 as a slave state. It was rough, sparsely populated, with weak institutions and strong traditions of vigilante justice. Into this environment came the Mormons, organized, communal, growing rapidly in numbers, buying land, establishing settlements, voting as a bloc. And critically, they were mostly from the Northeast and many opposed slavery. By 1833, about 1,200 Mormons lived in Jackson County. The local non-Mormon population, known to Mormons as Old Settlers, became increasingly hostile. The reasons were complex. Political. Mormons voted as a unified bloc, threatening to overwhelm local politics. Economic. Mormons were buying up land and establishing businesses. Cultural. Mormons were mostly from the Northeast, different from Southern origin Missourians. Religious. Mormons claimed Jackson County was sacred ground, destined for Mormon settlement. Slavery. Many Mormons opposed slavery. Missouri was a slave state in a region with tensions over the issue. In 1833, Boggs passively saw community leaders and officials sign demands for Mormon withdrawal, and next force a gun barrel contract to abandon the county before spring planting. In July 1833, a mob destroyed the Mormon printing press and tarred and feathered 2 Mormon leaders. In November, vigilantes attacked Mormon settlements, burning homes, whipping men, driving families into the winter cold. The Mormons fled north to neighboring Clay and Ray counties. Facing increasing hostility from neighboring settlers, an 1833 crisis resulted in their forceful eviction from Jackson County by vigilantes. No one was prosecuted for these attacks. The vigilantes faced no consequences. This would establish a pattern. Violence against Mormons was tolerated, even encouraged. The Missouri legislature created Caldwell County in 1836 as a compromise for displaced Mormon settlers. The idea was simple: give the Mormons their own county where they could live without conflict. Caldwell County was carved out of Ray County specifically for Mormon settlement, with the implicit understanding that Mormons would stay there and not spread into other counties. The Mormons built Far West, which quickly became a thriving town of several thousand. For a time, the compromise seemed to work. Mormons had their own space, governed by their own people, building their Zion. But Mormons kept coming. By 1838, perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 Latter-day Saints lived in northern Missouri. And they didn't just stay in Caldwell County. They began settling in neighboring Daviess County and elsewhere. The old settlers grew alarmed. This was supposed to be contained. Now Mormons were spreading, buying land, establishing new settlements. The situation was escalating toward another crisis. In early 1838, Joseph Smith fled Ohio, where he faced arrest on banking fraud charges, and arrived in Far West. In January 1838, Smith fled to Missouri from Ohio to avoid a warrant for his arrest, and joined the Mormon community in the town of Far West, which became the New Zion. Smith's arrival energized the Mormon community but also intensified tensions. Now their prophet was here. Far West became the church headquarters. The gathering accelerated. On July 4, 1838, Sidney Rigdon, Smith's counselor, delivered a fiery speech that would haunt the Mormons. On July 4, 1838, Sidney Rigdon warned that the Saints would no longer tolerate persecution or the denial of their rights as citizens of the United States. If mobs gathered, he thundered in a widely publicized oration, "It shall be between us and them a war of extermination, for we will follow them until the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us." Read that language, war of extermination. Rigdon was using extreme rhetoric to say Mormons would defend themselves to the death. But that phrase, war of extermination, would come back to destroy them. Around this time, some Mormon men formed a secret organization called the Danites. During this period, some Latter-day Saint men organized a vigilante group known as the Danites, who pledged to defend the Saints against further violence. The Danites' exact role remains controversial and debated by historians. Were they simply a defensive militia, or were they an offensive paramilitary group engaging in vigilante violence against Mormon enemies? The truth is probably both. The Danites began as protection against mob violence but evolved into something more aggressive, burning homes of old settlers, intimidating dissenters, raiding non-Mormon towns. A covert Mormon paramilitary unit, the Danites, was formed to pillage non-Mormon towns, while angry rhetoric rose from both sides. Whether justified as self-defense or not, the Danites' actions terrified non-Mormons and provided ammunition for those who wanted Mormons expelled. The immediate trigger for the Mormon War was violence at an election. On August 6, 1838, Daviess County held elections. When Mormons attempted to vote, they were attacked by non-Mormons who insisted Mormons had no right to vote in Daviess County. Despite being legal residents and citizens, a brawl erupted. Several men on both sides were injured. Rumors spread wildly, exaggerated on both sides. Non-Mormons claimed Mormons had killed several men. False. Mormons claimed they'd been attacked simply for exercising their right to vote, closer to truth. Joseph Smith led a group of armed Mormons to Daviess County to defend Mormon settlers. This was seen by non-Mormons as Mormon aggression, an armed prophet leading an army. From August through October 1838, the situation spiraled. Intimidation, property destruction, small skirmishes, raids and counter-raids. In mid-October, Latter-day Saints raided and burned homes and stores in Gallatin and Millport. Civil authority collapsed. Local militias were mobilized, but they took sides rather than keeping peace. Missouri was sliding toward civil war between Mormons and everyone else. On October 24, 1838, the conflict reached a critical point at the Battle of Crooked River. A Missouri state militia unit had seized several Mormon hostages. A Mormon rescue party, led by Apostle David W. Patton, attempted to free them. The two forces met at Crooked River in the pre-dawn darkness. Shots were fired. At Crooked River, Saints and Missouri militiamen skirmished, resulting in the deaths of one Missourian and two church members. including Apostle David W. Patton. The Battle of Crooked River was a minor skirmish, perhaps 75 Mormons against 50 militiamen, lasting minutes. But its impact was enormous. Exaggerated reports reached Governor Boggs. Meanwhile, exaggerated reports from the Battle of Crooked River made their way to Missouri's Governor, Lilburn Boggs. The reports claimed Mormons had killed multiple militiamen, the actual number was 1, that Mormons were in open rebellion, that they were attacking and burning towns across northern Missouri. The reports portrayed Mormons as an insurgent army threatening the state. Lilburn Boggs was not neutral. Boggs was considered more adversarial towards the Mormons than his predecessor, and, as lieutenant governor, had sided with the vigilantes who had expelled the Mormons from Jackson County in 1833. Boggs had been personally involved in the 1833 expulsion from Jackson County. He had no sympathy for Mormons. Now, receiving reports, however exaggerated, that Mormons were in armed rebellion, he acted decisively. On October 27, 1838, 3 days after the Battle of Crooked River, Boggs issued Missouri Executive Order 44. The full text of the order is chilling in its brevity. The Mormons must be treated as enemies, and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description. Let's be clear about what this meant. The order sought to put a quick end to the conflict by calling for the saints to be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary. Exterminated. The word has one meaning: complete destruction. To exterminate is to eradicate entirely. Possibly playing on Rigdon's July 4th sermon that talked of a war of extermination, Boggs issued Missouri Executive Order 44. Boggs may have been echoing Mormon rhetoric back at them, but he was the governor of a state issuing a military order. His words carried the force of law and the power of the state militia. For example, in the case of the forcible removal of American Indians, United States officials used the phrase exterminating war to describe the use of force to achieve either the Indians' total expulsion or total extinction. The language of extermination wasn't unprecedented in 19th century America. It had been used regarding Native American removal. But that context doesn't make it less horrifying. It shows that American authorities were comfortable with genocidal language and action against populations they deemed problematic. On October 30, 1838, 3 days after the extermination order, armed Missourians attacked the Mormon settlement at Haun's Mill. On the afternoon of October 30, 1838, the most lamentable and tragic episode of the Mormon-Missouri War took place at an isolated Mormon settlement in eastern Caldwell County known as Haun's Mill. 17 Latter-day Saint civilians were killed and another 14 wounded by an extra-legal force composed of over 200 men. The attack was systematic and brutal. Over 200 armed men surrounded the small settlement. Mormons fled to a blacksmith shop for shelter. The attackers fired through the gaps in the logs, killing those inside. The Haun's Mill massacre took place on October 30, 1838, 3 days after the order. It was perpetrated by Missouri State Guardsmen from Livingston County on the settlement of Haun's Mill. Among the dead, a 10-year-old boy named Sardius Smith. He hid under the bellows in the blacksmith shop. An attacker found him and shot him in the head at point-blank range. When questioned later about killing a child, the man reportedly said, "Nits make lice," suggesting that Mormon children would grow into Mormon adults and therefore had to be killed. 17 people died. The attackers left without facing any resistance. The Mormons at Haun's Mill were essentially defenseless. While most scholars state there is little evidence that the militiamen knew of the executive order, there is at least one first-hand account claiming the perpetrators cited the governors ordering their extermination as the motive of the massacre. Whether the attackers knew about the extermination order or not, the order had created an atmosphere where such violence was permissible, even encouraged. By late October, thousands of Missouri militiamen surrounded Far West, the Mormon headquarters. Boggs mustered 2,500 state militiamen to put down what he considered a Mormon insurrection against the state. The Mormons were outnumbered and outgunned. They had perhaps 500 to 800 men capable of fighting against 2,500 state militia, with more arriving. They had women, children, elderly, thousands of non-combatants who needed protection. On November 1, 1838, Mormon leaders negotiated a surrender. Mormons surrendered on November 1, 1838. The surrender terms were harsh. Mormon leaders would be arrested and tried for treason. All Mormons would leave Missouri. Mormons would surrender their weapons. Mormon property would be confiscated to pay damages. General John B. Clark, commanding the militia, made the stakes clear. General Clark cited Executive Order 44 soon after the Mormon settlers surrendered in November 1838, saying that violence would have been used had they chosen not to surrender. The order of the governor was to me that you should be exterminated and not allowed to remain in the state, and had not your leaders been given up, and the terms of this treaty complied with, your families before this time would have been destroyed, and your houses in ashes. Read that again. The general explicitly stated that if Mormons hadn't surrendered, their families would have been destroyed and their homes burned. This was the threat. Surrender and leave or face extermination. Joseph Smith and other Mormon leaders were arrested and charged with treason, murder, arson, and other crimes. They were imprisoned without trial for months in Liberty Jail, Missouri, a cramped, cold, filthy cell where they spent the winter of 1838 to 39. One general, Alexander Doniphan, refused to execute the Mormon prisoners as ordered, reportedly stating it would be cold-blooded murder, and he would hold his commander responsible before an earthly tribunal. The Mormon leaders were eventually transferred and allowed to escape, likely with unofficial permission from authorities who wanted them gone more than they wanted them dead. Smith and others fled to Illinois to join the Mormon refugees there. On October 27, 1838, 3 days after Missouri and Mormon militias engaged in the Battle of Crooked River, Governor Boggs issued his infamous extermination order. To his military leaders, it decreed, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state, if necessary for the public good. Following the surrender, approximately 10,000 Mormons faced expulsion. At the time, perhaps 10,000 Mormons were concentrated in two particular counties. Their chief settlement was Far West in Caldwell County. Far West had a population by then of about 5,000 saints, and another 5,000 lived in at least 19 other Latter-day Saint communities in Caldwell County. This wasn't a voluntary migration. This was forced ethnic cleansing. An entire population, men, women, children, elderly, sick, were driven from their homes at gunpoint in the dead of winter. The conditions were brutal. This was Missouri in winter, freezing temperatures, snow, ice. Families left with whatever they could carry or load into wagons. Many left with almost nothing, having had their property seized or destroyed. Once Latter-day Saints were disarmed, mounted squads visited Mormon settlements with threats and enough beatings and destruction of homes to force flight. Organized committees tried to help the most destitute families evacuate, but resources were limited. William Huntington calculated that the Saints in Daviess County alone lost 29,465 bushels of corn because of the military takeover. The exodus took months. Families traveled east, crossing Missouri toward the Mississippi River and refuge in Illinois. The journey could take weeks, in freezing weather with inadequate supplies, children and elderly suffering. The Saints' exodus from Missouri took place mostly during winter and involved four main arenas: Far West, Missouri, Quincy, Illinois, a road network between the two cities, and the West Shore mudflats across the Mississippi River from Quincy. Quincy, Illinois became the main refuge. The citizens of Quincy, to their credit, welcomed the Mormon refugees, providing shelter and supplies. Communities in Illinois offered safe haven to refugee Latter-day Saints, expressing their objections to what had happened in Missouri. What happened to Mormon property left behind? It was stolen, systematically. Meanwhile, the mob plundered $1,000 worth of property, which had been left by the exiled brethren and sisters to help the poor to remove. Missouri militia and civilians looted Mormon homes and farms. Those present agreed that it was the duty of those who have to assist those plundering Mormons of all the means of sustenance, scanty as it was, left them, driving off their cattle, horses, hogs, etc., and rifling their houses and farms of everything thereon, taking beds, bedding, wardrobes, leaving them destitute. Organized committees of Mormons tried to retrieve livestock and property under military permits, but they faced constant threats. Huntington recorded that the mob were in the habit of tying the brethren up to trees and whipping them even to death. Eventually, even these recovery efforts became too dangerous. On April 18th, he ordered them to wind up their affairs and leave immediately, for their lives were in danger. That day, 12 non-Mormons went to Theodore Turley's place with loaded rifles to shoot him. They broke scores of clocks into matchwood, broke tables, smashed windows, hit Turley with an iron pot, shot down cows while girls were milking them, and threatened they would kill the committee members if they did not leave town. When Saints pulled out of Far West, their houses, barns, fences, stores, schools, farms, farm equipment, household goods, livestock, and stored grain fell into non-Mormons' hands. Think about what this means. 10,000 people built homes, farms, businesses, communities. Then they were driven out at gunpoint, and everything they'd built was stolen. The economic value alone was enormous. The human cost incalculable. Even after most Mormons had left, violence continued. The endangered men gathered what they could and left Far West within the hour. The mob, meanwhile, plundered $1,000 worth of property which had been left by the exiled brethren and sisters to help the poor to remove. Missouri authorities considered extending the expulsion order indefinitely. In December 1838 and early January 1839, the Missouri state legislature, by a close vote, refused to overturn Governor Boggs's extermination order. Some voices in Missouri opposed the cruelty. Some opinions downstate held that Mormons would not have to leave at all. The Missouri Argus's editor argued incorrectly on December 20, 1838, that they cannot be driven beyond the limits of the state, that is certain. To do so would be to act with extreme cruelty. But these voices were in the minority. The expulsion continued. The extermination order remained in effect. The Missouri experience fundamentally shaped Mormon culture and theology for generations. The Saints' persecution in several states and then expulsion by order of a state governor helps explain why they obtained a charter for a self-defensive city-state in Nauvoo with the Nauvoo Legion, why some saints justified retaliation against persecutors, why many gladly exited the United States and headed toward Mexican territory in 1846, and why many saints, if not the church, expressed distaste for judges, courts, deputies, the federal army during the Utah War, and anti-polygamy laws. Think about what this taught Mormons. State governments cannot be trusted to protect your rights. Courts and legal systems will side against you. You need your own militia for self-defense. Staying in the United States means continued persecution. Separation from American society is necessary for survival. When Mormons eventually settled Utah, then Mexican territory, later U.S. territory, they built a society designed to be as independent as possible from federal authority. The seeds of that separatism were planted in Missouri in 1838. After the Mormon exodus, were the perpetrators of violence prosecuted? No. Were those who stole Mormon property held accountable? No. Was anyone punished for the murders at Haun's Mill? No. The only people prosecuted were the Mormon leaders, charged with treason and other crimes, charges that were eventually dropped or resulted in escapes that were likely officially sanctioned. The vigilantes who drove Mormons from Jackson County in 1833, unpunished. The attackers at Haun's Mill who killed 17 people, unpunished. The Missouri militia members who burned Mormon homes and stole their property, unpunished. The state's response to the conflict provoked widespread controversy and severely damaged Boggs's political standing. Governor Boggs faced political criticism, but not legal consequences. He served out his term. Later, in 1842, someone attempted to assassinate him. He survived, and Mormons were blamed, though never definitively proven responsible. Here's what should shock you. The extermination order was officially rescinded on June 25, 1976, by Governor Christopher Samuel Kit Bond. 1976. The order remained Missouri state law for 138 years. For more than a century, Missouri law officially authorized the extermination or expulsion of Mormons. It was legally permissible to kill or drive out members of a specific religious group. This wasn't because anyone forgot about it. Mormons certainly didn't forget. But Missouri didn't bother to officially rescind the order until 1976, During the U.S. bicentennial, when Governor Bond finally rescinded it, he stated, "Whereas, Governor Boggs' order clearly contravened the rights to life, liberty, property, and religious freedom as guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States, as well as the Constitution of the State of Missouri, expressing on behalf of all Missourians our deep regret for the injustice and undue suffering which was caused by the 1838 order, I hereby rescind Executive Order Number 44. Deep regret. That's the closest Missouri ever came to apologizing for ordering the extermination of a religious minority. The Missouri-Mormon War has been largely erased from mainstream American history. Most Americans have never heard of it. It's not taught in most schools. When mentioned at all, it's framed as a conflict or dispute, minimizing what actually happened. Why the erasure? Uncomfortable truths. The Mormon War forces Americans to confront that religious persecution happened here, not just in Europe. State governments committed ethnic cleansing. Genocidal language and action were directed at American citizens. Legal systems failed to protect a religious minority. No one was held accountable. Regional embarrassment. Missouri would prefer not to be known for ordering the extermination of a religious group. Religious controversy. The Mormon Church itself was, and remains, controversial. Some Americans are uncomfortable defending Mormons' rights because they view Mormon theology as heretical or problematic. Complexity. The Mormon War involved genuine conflicts, political, economic, cultural. It's easier to forget it than to grapple with the complexity while acknowledging that none of that complexity justified extermination. Mormon migration. Mormons left the United States entirely. Utah was then Mexican territory. So the immediate visibility of the victims disappeared. Out of sight, out of historical memory. The Missouri Extermination Order fits into a broader American pattern of state-sponsored violence against religious and ethnic minorities. Native American removal and genocide. Slavery and the violent suppression of enslaved people. Chinese Exclusion Act. Japanese American internment. The Tulsa Race Massacre and other anti-black pogroms. In each case, the pattern is similar. Dominant group feels threatened by minority group. Authorities either permit or actively engage in violence. Victims are blamed for provoking the violence. Perpetrators face no consequences. History is erased, minimized, or justified. Missouri Executive Order 44 is an American atrocity that fits this pattern perfectly. Within Mormon culture, the Missouri period is remembered as a time of martyrdom and persecution. Stories of the Exodus are passed down through families. The suffering is commemorated in church teachings and pioneer celebrations. But there's a tension. How do you remember persecution without cultivating perpetual victim identity? How do you acknowledge injustice without being consumed by grievance? Modern Mormons have largely moved past seeing themselves as persecuted, though that history still shapes Mormon culture in complex ways. The church has become wealthy, politically powerful, socially integrated. But the collective memory of Missouri, of being driven from homes, having property stolen, facing an extermination order, remains part of Mormon identity. Some questions about the Mormon War remain contested. Were Mormons partly responsible? Clearly some Mormons engaged in aggressive actions. The Danitez raided settlements. Rigdon's rhetoric was inflammatory. But even acknowledging Mormon actions, does that justify an extermination order? Does it justify Haun's Mill? Does it justify driving 10,000 people into winter exile? Could compromise have prevented this? Perhaps. But both sides had maximalist positions. Mormons believed they were building God's kingdom and had divine right to the land. Old settlers believed Mormons threatened their political and economic control. Compromise required one side accepting less than they believed they deserved. Why extermination language? Boggs could have ordered arrest, expulsion, military occupation. Why use the word exterminate? Was it just rhetoric? Or did it reflect genuine willingness to commit genocide? What would have happened without surrender? General Clark explicitly stated Mormon families would have been destroyed if they hadn't surrendered. Was that a bluff? Or was Missouri prepared to massacre thousands? On October 27, 1838, an American governor issued an order stating, The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Exterminated. That order resulted in 22 deaths, including children, 10,000 people driven from their homes, systematic theft of property, winter exile of entire communities, religious persecution backed by state authority. And for 138 years, that order remained Missouri law. The Missouri Extermination Order teaches us several uncomfortable truths. Religious freedom is fragile. Even with constitutional protection, when a religious minority becomes sufficiently unpopular, authorities will tolerate or encourage persecution. State violence is enabled by dehumanizing language. Exterminate wasn't accidental. That language, treating people as vermin to be eradicated, makes atrocity possible. Economic and political competition fuels conflict. The Mormon War wasn't just about theology. It was about land, voting power, economic control. Religious differences provided the excuse, but material interests drove the violence. Victims get blamed. Then and now, people ask, but what did the Mormons do to provoke this? As if anything could justify an extermination order. History gets erased. It took 138 years for Missouri to officially rescind the order. Most Americans still don't know this happened. Uncomfortable history disappears if we let it. In 2024, we like to think we're past this. We have stronger institutions, better protections for religious freedom, more awareness of minority rights. But are we? Do we still use dehumanizing language about groups we fear or dislike? Do we still blame victims for the persecution they face? Do we still enable state violence against minorities by looking away, by making excuses, by forgetting? The Missouri Extermination Order wasn't ancient history. It was officially Missouri law until 1976, within living memory. The last Mormon refugees from Missouri died in living memory. And the question the Extermination Order poses is timeless. What happens when the state decides a group of people is too problematic to tolerate? What protects minorities when majorities want them gone? In 1838, the answer was nothing. The state issued an extermination order. 10,000 people were driven from their homes. And America forgot. On October 27, 1838, Missouri declared war on its own citizens. Not metaphorically, literally, with military force. With an official order authorizing extermination. 22 people died. 10,000 were exiled. An entire religious community was ethnically cleansed from a state. No one was held accountable. The order remained law for 138 years. History was erased. Say their names. Remember what happened. Ask yourself, could it happen again? Because forgetting is how it becomes possible again.